Hello peeps, this is Kimberly Purpose and welcome to my channel. I am doing on this particular blog, I'm going to do another video on the American Aborigines and the slave trade. This is going to be part number 3 in the series, and it's based on an article that was written by Rebecca Onion. The title of the article is America's Other Original Sin. Now, let's see. I'm on the page number 3 of the article, and I'm going to start with the intro. It says, Europeans didn't just displace Native Americans. They enslaved them and encouraged tribes to participate in slave trade on a scale historians are only beginning to fathom. Now, I didn't finish the last part of the other section of the article, so I wanted to finish the conclusion part. And they were talking about how the differences between Native American tribes slavery in comparison to European slavery that was brought into the United States. Now, the last paragraph says, while the histories of Native enslavement and enslaving might seem to be separate spheres to study, they too are intertwined. Tribal groups could find themselves shifting from enslavers to enslaved as their relationship to Euro-Americans and with other tribes changed over time. To illustrate this concept, Snyder points to the story of the Westo Indians, a group originally from around Lake Erie who spoke an Iroquoian language. They left the North in the middle of the 17th century. Snyder says probably because Iroquois' competition over guns and slaving moved to the southeast, where they enslaved local Indians for sale for colonists. But then the colonists got anxious, or they were afraid that this group was too powerful, Snyder said. In 1680, a group of Carolinians armed the Savannah Indians and empowered them to break the Westos' strength in the area. The remaining Westos were themselves sold to the Caribbeans as slaves, the Caribbean. So that's what happened, y'all. Sort of just like what's going on today. The Europeans were very nervous with the Native Indians, the Iroquois Indians, because they were growing and they were becoming very successful in the slave trade and everything, and they had getting more and more weaponry and guns. So they thought that they were going to be a problem later on. So they eventually enslaved them too. They befriended him. After they used them for what they needed and what they want, they turned against them and enslaved them and sent them to the Caribbean. That's exactly what happened. They sent them to the islands. They did that a lot, I noticed, in history. And it's sort of reflection what's going on in today's society. I just sort of find it ironic how, Europeans, the Caucasians, feel threatened, with the Indians becoming powerful. I guess they have an issue when blacks in the United States who are the descendants of a lot of these Indians now. I believe the Iroquois, if they anywhere from the East Coast, they may be Aboriginal Indians. So if they were thrown in slavery, more than likely they were Aborigines. And here in the United States, they still had that tendency to be threatened by blacks having any type of weaponry or gun or self-defense. And I think that's why a lot of cops, they just are threatened by the blacks having any kind of gun, so they shoot them just like they did back in the olden days. I don't know if it's just genetic or hereditary that the Europeans want to kill people for no apparent reason if they haven't really done anything to them. But I just think that's interesting. It's just sort of like a strong correlation between the past history and behaviors and the psychology of Europeans of the past is still embedded in the ones that are going on today with the killings and blacks and justice not being served of all the indigenous Aborigines of today, who are the AKA African Americans, who are getting gunned down by Europeans today. A lot of the things are still happening. Yahweh is watching. Things are going to change. Things are going to have to, because you can't keep on destroying God's children and think that it's not going to eventually come back to you multiplied. Karma always have a way. You can see it in the Bible with the Egyptians, when the Egyptians kept on messing with the Hebrews, and Moses said, "Let my people go," and he just kept on a lot of these crazy plagues and everything that's going on. It's sort of happening today. You see it is the story is repeated over and over again from biblical times to now. Biblical time, the slave days of the American slave trade during from the 1500s to the 1800s, and the Jim Crow laws, and even up to today. It's just a reflection of what happened in the past, and also, happening today. So hopefully we can learn from history. But anyway, I can get long-winded. Let me get back on the topic. I just wanted to tie that in as to how, history repeats itself, and how the psychology and the behavior of groups and people can be passed down from generation, and how it can be a cycle and very psychological, and it needs to be corrected. And we can all heal from it if we can learn to identify our flaws and work on improving our ideology and beliefs and mindset. But anyway, the article continues and going to a different topic. It starts on the next session. It starts talking about how the natives were having slaves, and a lot of the native when they captured a lot of the Aborigine Indians and the dark complexion Mongoloid Indians and threw them into slavery, the whole dynamic of leadership with the Indians, the natives, Indians, has totally changed. Most of the people in the leadership later on were either Europeans pretending to be Indians, because most of them, I looked at the pictures in the history book, they were very pale, extremely pale, completely whitewashed. I question whether or not majority of them had any type of Indian blood, because Indians were brown people, dark-skinned complexion people, especially the Aborigines, and a lot of them look more European or barely biracial, if biracial at all. I believe a lot of the Europeans took leadership roles and pretend to be Indians, just so they could take over the leadership of the Indian and disband them and weaken the powers of the indigenous people within each tribe. But anyway, that's my theory on it. But I'm going to continue. I'm going to read on. It says, in the late 18th century Southeast, the native relationship to slavery took a surprising turn. There, a relatively small group of Cherokees, Creek, Choctaws, and Chickasaws held Africans in bondage. Historian Taya Miles has written two histories of Cherokee slave holdings. Miles placed the numbers of enslaved people held by Cherokees at 600 at the start of the 19th century, which is the 1800s, and around 1500 at the time of the westward removal in 1838. Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, she said, held around 3,500 slaves across the three nations as the 19th century began. So, I'm still in the middle of this paragraph. I just was thinking about that. A lot, like, we got to keep in mind, a lot of this indigenous people got captured. Indians, the natives were fighting among themselves because Indians started following the tactics of the European trade, slave trade, and that's what broke up the Indians and caused more of a drift between each tribe. And each tribe might have comforted each other. The people they had as slaves, a lot of them, I would say, majority of them were indigenous. They were not African. They keep on labeling them Africans, but we got to remember, all the indigenous people that were captured were reclassified as Indian because they followed the same rules as the Europeans when it came to classifying everybody who go into the slave trade as black, especially the dark-skinned black Indians. I'm not going to say about the other people of different ethnicities, whether or not they were classified, but we do know for sure that the Aborigines and also the darker complexion Mongoloids were thrown into the slave trade, was thrown into slavery, and a lot of them were captured from wars between, different Indian wars, and that's how they got caught. But anyway, let's continue. It says slavery inched its way slowly into Cherokee life, Miles told. When a white man moved into native locations, usually to work as a trader or as an Indian agent, he owned African slaves. Once again, that same narrative, African, let's say indigenous slaves. That's what most of them were, indigenous or biracial, Afro, Afro-American slaves, I guess you could call them if they were biracial. But anyway, let's continue. If such a person had a child with a native woman, or was uncommon for the half European, half native child would inherit the enslaved people and their children under white law, as well as the rights to use tribal land. Using the tribal law, the combination was put people in a position to expand their wealth, eventually operating large farms and plantations. This was the story of James Vaughn, the father of Joseph, the steamboat owner. The elder Vaughn's mother was Cherokee, while his father was white. That's what I was talking about. Like I said before, they allowed the biracial Cherokees, Indian, to follow the laws of the Indian trade. That's exactly what happened. And a lot of them were very fair skinned. They didn't really look, a lot of them didn't even look Indian to me, especially from the books I saw. They looked more like Italians. A dark skin, a darker complexion, white person with a little tan, but still had European features. Some of them I probably were not even Indians. They were just Europeans pretending to be Indians, just so they can get their role, be over everything that's in Indian territory. They was trying to disband the Indians and weaken the powers within their infrastructure, so it would make it easier for Europeans to take over and take ownership of their land. So what better way is to have a white person claiming Indian, and just so they can just say, oh, I'm Indian, they put it in writing, even though it's not true. They're not and they take all the lands from all the Indians, the indigenous people, especially the dark-skinned ones. And what they did is they reclassified all the darker complexion Indians as slaves, and kept all the light-skinned ones, that look more European, the biracial ones, and the ones that are not even European, that just might have married into a family, and they classified themselves as the chiefs of the tribe. And this in turn is what broke up the tribe and dismantled it. So let's go on to the next paragraph. In the second and third decades of the 19th century, the Cherokee strategy to keep the American government from taking their land was to prove their own sovereignty as citizens and civilized people. They were trying, Miles says, to form a Cherokee government that looked like the U.S. government, to publish laws, establish a Supreme Court, establish a principal city, to create a police force, to create newspaper. These efforts were concurrent with the growth of slavery, another adopted tradition that would show that Cherokee were truly assimilated. So they were trying to fit in with European laws and everything, but it's sort of hard to do when you have mostly Europeans in leadership role over your establishment. Because of course, when I saw those pictures, they didn't look like true Indians to me. Most of them looked like they say they were biracial, but some of them look like just plain white men with a little tan, pretending to be Indian. So that's skeptical. You know, it might have been a white guy that married an Indian, and he decided to call himself chief, and he's still European, so he's technically not an Indian. That's my theory. And just took the role as chief and just became chief. And so that way they can, do things the way they want to and dismantle the whole infrastructure. And that's pretty much what happened. But anyway, let's go on. It says the United States government, Congress considered itself a charge of Indian affairs started in the 1780s, establishing a series of governmental structures meant to manage tribal relations. Had really clear ideas of what it was meant to be civilized, Miles said. Okay, I'm gonna stop here. I just think it's funny. I was just thinking how in the earlier they took the 100% indigenous people that are Aborigines out. They are more Indian, and they stole their culture and everything, and told them that they had to prove that they are, well, really, the blacks, they weren't allowed to do anything. Actually, they made them slaves. But I think the ones that might have been Mongoloid Indians, that, they had to prove themselves as being Indian, where the half-breeds are the ones that are European that just married in. They claim they are 100% Indian, and the ones that are 100% Indian that are Mongoloid had to prove themselves, which I think is totally ironic and ridiculous. But pretty much that was what's happening. The people who were less Indian were given the power over the infrastructure, and the people that were more Indian were not. They had to prove themselves, which I thought was ridiculous. But it happened. That's how it went. That's how it went with when you based everything on eugenics and white supremacy and these laws that were passed to support European. That's what happened. But anyway, let's continue on. It says here that's included a different gendered differentiation. Woo, had a hard time saying that, of labor. So men were supposed to stop hunting. They were supposed to come back and farm. See, they shift the gender roles. They shift the roles. And then the women were supposed to be in the household. And enslaved people were supposed to be out in the fields helping to produce even more crops, and eventually allowed the native men to have more of a supervisory role. Indian agents, white men appointed by Congress, liaised with the tribes, would report to their supervisors on the degree to which Cherokee slaveholders were fulfilling the expectation of white observers. Some white onlookers thought James Vaughn far too lenient in the way he socialized with, and by count, 70 Africans who worked on his plantation. Still, he prospered, eventually owning 400 to 800 acres of land, a store, a tavern, and a trading post. Wow, I'm impressed. He did very well for himself. Even though, he was biracial, having a white father enabled him to be able to do some things. And I think it's good that he didn't abuse his slaves like a lot of the people in that time period. But anyway, yeah, so they still pretty much talking about Cherokee. Let's go into the next section. It says, the material success of slave owners such as Vaughn did not, in the end, saved the Cherokees from removal. While some native slave owners in the South may have been temporarily enriched by slave holdings, historian Claudio Saltz argues as